Welcome to Module 7. This is the first video lecture for Module 7, and it's letter A in your outline if you're in the learning materials part of Module 7. If you go back to the first part there in Module 7, you'll see the introduction, which has a more detailed outline, and we will be following through that outline. On this video, we have all of letter A, including the 5 subcategories, creation and so forth, that you will see there. So that locates where we are. If you want to take a minute just to go look at the module again or print out the outline, feel free to do so. And you can stop this video anytime you want, and you can go back or look for other materials, which I'll occasionally direct you to. As you can see, the format's a little bit different. The first 6 modules of this series were recorded in a classroom setting, and we had 5 chaplains who met with us, and so there was some give and take. But now the rest of the lectures will come in a format where I am speaking directly to you and you alone. We're in a special studio in the same building in which the earlier videos were taken, and this is a faculty studio in which we can record things just like this. So, my intention for these lectures is not to repeat everything that you will see in the readings. The readings for Modules 7 through 10 are all drawn from my book, Meet God Again for the First Time, and they cover in considerable detail the issues that we want to cover in these 4 modules. However, what I will want to do in these videos is particularly by way of emphasis. Oral presentation allows things like tone of voice, gestures like this, and simply the way I'm talking to you and emphasizing certain things. You can be clearer in the oral presentation than you can be in writing, even though it may be harder to remember the details. So the lectures, the readings will work closely together. There'll be a lot of overlap, but in mastering both of those, I think you will have a stronger understanding of the topic than you would with either one alone. So let's begin. We're in Module 7A, and this is the biblical theology portion of the course. We've been talking in general about hermeneutics. We've come to understand what exegesis is, what biblical theology is, what systematic theology is. Module 10 gets more into the area of systematic theology, where we deal with the implications of the biblical material. But in 7 through 9, we're going to walk basically from Genesis to Revelation and take a look how the Bible writers' own intentions, how their own world and worldview was involved in presenting the material that they gave, and how God, through the Holy Spirit, oversaw the entire Scriptures into a seamless whole that has powerful implications for the way we live today. So let's get started. We'll begin at the beginning. And the first portion of letter A is the creation story. And you will want to take a look at chapter 2 in the book Meet God Again and refer to it from time to time. If you have been checking in the website, the Learning Materials website, this is my printout of the first page of chapter 2 that you have available to you there under 7A. And we'll be following pretty much along that line. Now, as you read the creation story, you come to realize that the whole thing in chapter 1 of Genesis is building up to a climax. And the climax is the creation of humanity. While animals are important to God, while the natural world is very important to God, it is with human beings that He is communicating in the book of Genesis. And so human beings are the high point of the creation story. Adam and Eve, the high point of the creation story. Then in chapter 2, there's a second story of creation, and that one focuses simply on the relation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So it elaborates on the story in chapter 1. The high point is in chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. And I'd like to invite you to turn to a Bible, pause the video if you need to do that, and get a Bible and follow with me as best that you can. Verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock and over all the earth." Now there's a couple of relationships here you want to notice. First of all, human beings are created in the image of God. Since they're created in the image of God, that means that they are intentionally related to God. God is like a mentor. Human beings are like disciples. And there is a natural relationship that was intended from the beginning. At the same time, there's a second relationship mentioned in this text, and that relationship is the human beings also relate to the earth. So they have dominion over the earth. They are to rule over the earth. And so human beings are also created with a natural relationship to the earth, to the environment. In this case, the roles are reversed. It is human beings who are in the mentor role, and it is the creation that is in the disciple role. So human beings are designed to relate to God in the same way that the environment relates to human beings. Human beings are to see God's mentoring of them as the model for their stewardship over the creation. So in this very first verse here, verse 26 of chapter 1, we see the establishment of relationships as very central to the creation account. Verse 27, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." This verse repeats the concept that human beings are in the image of God, in God's likeness, that there's a natural relationship between human beings and God, but then it adds an additional dimension. Male and female, he created them. The image of God is not just male. The image of God is male and female. That it is in both, in relation to each other, that the fullness of the image of God is exhibited. So there's a natural relationship also between human beings and each other. Human beings alone are not complete. Human beings are complete only in community. That's a very important concept that we come to understand here as we look at Genesis 1, verses 26 and 27. Let's take a look at verse 28, just to complete the passage. "God blessed them, male and female, and said to them, 'Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves on the ground.'" So human beings were designed in this mentoring, ruling relationship over the creation. They were designed to work with the creation, to work with the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, the animals that move along the ground. The entire creation is subject to them. Now, if you go to your handout and you go to page 17, you will see an illustration there that may be helpful to you. And I'm holding up the page. I don't know how well you can see that, but that's what your page will look like, page 17. And you will notice that there's an illustration on the upper right-hand part. And it's an illustration with a number of arrows. So you have an upward arrow. The X in the middle would be Adam and Eve. You have an upward arrow pointing to God. That represents the relationship of subordination that human beings have to God. You have sideward arrows between the Adam and Eve and others, the way it's set up here. This is natural relationship, and it's a relationship of equality. And then you have the relationship downward to the earth. So you have all three of those relationships illustrated there. And take a look at that illustration, because I think it'll be helpful to you in grasping what Genesis 1:26 to 28 are all about. So how does this creation story function in the whole Pentateuch? The Pentateuch is the first 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Why is the creation story the starting point? Why is it there right at the beginning? 2 things. First of all, it indicates that all nations have the same God. You see, every other nation at this time had gods of its own. People didn't think in terms of a universal God back then, but rather you had the gods of Egypt, the gods of Babylon, the gods of the Hittites, etc., the gods of the Canaanites. But Israel's story is different. The Creator in Israel's context is Israel's God. And all nations are subject to that same God. All nations come from Adam and Eve. So this story doesn't favor one nation over another. Israel is not to be seen as uniquely human in some way, but rather God is the God of all nations, of all peoples, and all ethnic groups are related to one another. So there's a powerful lesson there about equality, equality of all different ethnic groups, all different races, equality of opportunity in God's intention. Israel then would have to be understood in the Bible as a missionary nation right from the start. Their role and their mission is to speak for God to the other nations that may seem to be a bit more distant from Him in the context we're talking about. A second point is that the creation story is the starting point of the covenant. That throughout the Bible, and we will go into this in much more detail, but throughout the Bible there's a strong sense that God is a God of covenant. He's a God that has rules and regulations. There are ways to behave in relation to God, and we will talk a lot more about that, particularly in module number 9. However, the main point of all this is, why are there rules and regulations? Why are there laws? And the underlying principle is that laws are grounded in relationship. Whenever people are in relationship to each other, particularly in a sinful world, there needs to be rules so that people know how to relate to each other. There's rules also for how people are to relate to God. And the purpose of the covenant is not oppressive. The purpose of the covenant is to clarify the boundaries, to provide security. Here's how people are going to behave. Here's how God is going to behave. Here's how He expects us to behave in relation to Him. When we do, things go well. When we don't, things don't go so well. So the purpose of law is not to be oppressive, but is to regulate relationships so that people can be secure in those relationships. Obviously, a couple that's gone to all the trouble of getting married is probably less likely to just walk away the next day than a couple that's simply living together. There's a covenant, there's a commitment to stay together through difficult times. That provides security in a relationship, and that ultimately is the purpose of law. So, you have in this story the fact that God has created the human race. They are the founders of all the nations. Israel, in the end, will represent God to these other nations, but they're all subject to the same God. And God is also the God of law, the God of covenant. And while those words are not mentioned in Genesis 1 and 2, they are nevertheless implied by the reality of relationships. A tragic thing, however, occurs shortly after the creation. You have the fall. You have the snake in the garden. You have Eve and the apple, as many people say. No mention of the fruit, actually, in the text. And a tragedy happens. And if you go to Genesis 1:27, talks about human beings in the image of God. And then you go to Genesis 6, verse 5, and it says about humanity there, all the thoughts and actions are simply evil all the time. What a contrast. Image of God, evil all the time. What went wrong there? The root of sin from Genesis story clearly is broken relationships. Broken relationship is where everything goes wrong. Broken relationship is what sin is all about. Later on, we talk about restoring human beings who have sinned. It's all about relationship. It's not just about rules and regulations and so on, but it's a relationship that is the key. If you're in relationship to God, all is good. If you're not in relationship to God, things are going to head downhill fast. So relationship is the root. And if you go to page 18 in the reading for this section, and here I have a copy of that, on page 18, you will notice that near the bottom on the right is another illustration. I'd like you to look at that while I'm talking to you here. So go ahead and get that, and then we'll continue. There you see the consequences of sin. On the one side, the relationship with God and human beings was distorted by fear. Human beings became afraid of God. They wanted to hide from Him. And obviously, hiding is not helpful in the process of relationship. The relationship with each other was disturbed by the fight that they had. Adam and Eve began blaming each other, began arguing almost as soon as sin took place. And so you see that the relationship between Adam and Eve was broken by sin and became distorted by lies and arguing and anger and so on. And then the creation itself began to decay. Flowers began to decay, weeds, etc., entered in. As you see on the other side of the model there, you have thorns, weeds, thistles getting in the way of the rulership or the stewardship that Adam and Eve had over the natural world. There's pain in childbirth that comes in, and it hinders the command of God to multiply and fulfill the earth. It becomes a more difficult process, just as the farming is more difficult. And then there's exile from the garden, in which God stays inside the garden. Adam and Eve are outside the garden, and between them is the angel with the flashing sword. So all of this is a story that beautifully illustrates, well, maybe beautiful isn't the right word, but it illustrates certainly the tragedy that occurs on account of sin. So you have a mixture in Genesis 3 of consequences that are natural and consequences that appear to be applied in some way. In other words, the exile from the garden is not something that just occurs naturally. The exile from the garden is something that God says, okay, we're going to put a guard here, we're going to move you over here, I'm going to stay over here. That seems to be applied in some sense, as is the childbirth pain and the thorns and the weeds that are expressed there. But fundamentally, Genesis 3 tells us that the original situation in the garden is seriously distorted. And from this time on in the Bible, you can speak in terms of problems and solutions. We noticed this when we took a look at James and Paul, how the Bible writers use different categories to discuss this. Sin, the human condition is described in terms of a problem. It could be a legal problem, a banking problem. It could be a relational problem. It could be described in different ways. And then there's a solution that uses metaphors from that same field. And so from Genesis 3 on, the human condition is clearly a problem that needs resolution, and therefore the salvation, the essentially salvation-orientedness of the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation. You can't do a hermeneutics of the Bible without talking about salvation. And that's why we've blended those two concepts in this class. So, in Genesis 4 through 11, you have the primeval history, and we're moving into the second part of this particular lecture video. The primeval history goes from Genesis 4 to 11, and it addresses what the world is like after the sin of Genesis 3. And there are three key themes here. First, that sin is an undoing of creation. And as you read your reading, you can see some of the details there. But in the original creation, God was separating and making distinct. He separated the waters above from the waters below. He separated the dry land from the sea. And in the flood, all those distinctions are destroyed. The rains come down, the floods come up, and the end result is the earth is covered with water, just like it was in before the original creation. So the earth goes back to the condition it was in before creation. So the interesting part, and you wouldn't necessarily see this in the English language, but the interesting part of all this is that the language of the flood story, both its destruction and its renewal, is the language of creation. In the Hebrew, you have a variety of words that you could choose to use, and those words could take you a lot of different directions. In the flood story, the author deliberately uses the language of Genesis 1 and 2 to describe what is taking place in the flood and beyond. And you can see some of the detail in your reading, so I won't go into that here. But on page 21, let me just point that to you just for a moment. You see the greenish box toward the bottom. If you have page 21 of your reading, go get that now. And you can take a look at that chart, and you see on the chart parallels between the creation and the flood stories. And you'll notice that the language is quite similar. Waters covering the earth, a wind or spirit blowing over the waters. In the original, it's the same language, the same word in the Hebrew for spirit and for wind. So a wind hovering over the waters, a spirit blowing over the waters, really the same thing in the original. So you see the winds of the flood are parallels to the spirit of chapter 1. There's no distinction made in the Hebrew. Dry land appears, dominion, a renewal of creation, a renewal of the covenant. You see a lot of parallels, but you'll notice while there are parallels, not every detail is repeated. You see, God is consistent. And when God acts, there are certain patterns in his action because of that consistency. But God is not only consistent, he's unpredictable. And that means you cannot simply predict what he will do in the future based on what he did in the past. There'll be a pattern there, but exactly how that pattern works out will not be obvious until the situation actually occurs. So we should not become prophets, if you will, and say, well, God has always acted this way, so now he's going to act the same way in the future. God always rescued his people in the past, so he's going to rescue us now. Well, that didn't always work out when people reasoned that way in biblical times. So God is consistent, he's unpredictable, he doesn't have to carry out every detail of the pattern, and God is also creative in the sense that he can do things that weren't in the pattern. He can do new things. So there's a tension as we see the great actions of God through the Bible, and we'll see more of this, that you'll see a consistency of action, a pattern. You will see times when God doesn't carry out every detail of the pattern, and you'll see times when he does new things that can become part of the pattern for the future. All three of these take place. So, in the primeval history, sin is the undoing of creation, but God's grace restores the creation. So we see these two things going side by side. Sin pulling the human race downhill, and God's grace pulling the human race back. So this tension between problem and solution is illustrated right here in the stories of the primeval history that followed after the creation stories. A third thing that is important to this part of the story is the fact that there are two sides to God's judgment in all of these stories. God acts in judgment, but his judgment is not simply negative. You know, sometimes people think, well, judgment's negative. Judgment is scary. If I go into the judgment, I should be afraid. I should be worried about things, you see. So that's kind of an attitude we have. Judgment is negative, but that's not the way Jews looked at it. In biblical times, the judgment was a positive. A Jew who was coming into the final judgment was going to sue before God and win heavy damages. I mean, that's a good thing, you see. So judgment is not simply a negative in the Old Testament, but rather also a positive. And the two are blended together very often. For example, in the story of the fall, God banishes Adam and Eve from the garden. That's a negative judgment. But what else does he do? He gives them promises of a Redeemer, and he clothes them with skins so that they're not going to be cold in the world that they're being banished to. He takes care of them. Even in the judgment, there is a positive as well. So the judgment there is both positive and negative. Cain, negative judgment is obvious. He's sent away from the rest of his family. But where's the positive judgment? He's marked so that no one will kill him because of what he has done. God is protecting him even in his banishment. So there's a positive and a negative judgment, both working together in that story. Flood story, same thing. Negative judgment, destruction of the world, destruction of most of humanity. Positive, there's provision made for their salvation. Not one human being needs to be lost. They can all come into the ark if they will. And I imagine the ark would have been a lot bigger if that were needed. But God knew who he was dealing with. And he makes provision that no one needs to be lost, but leaves it up to them how they will respond to the judgment. So judgment in a real sense is not God arbitrarily saying, you know, this is good and that's bad and I'm going to punish this and so on. A judgment in a real sense is simply inviting people to make decisions and accept the consequences of those decisions. If you make this decision, these good things will happen. If you make that bad decision, you know, those bad things are going to happen. It's laid out before us, and we kind of have a choice. So that's how judgment is taking place here. Now, when you get to the end of the primeval history, you get to the Tower of Babel, and there you see God in judgment again. And the negative judgment is obvious. It is the scattering of the people, the confusing of their languages, and as all of this is taking place, they're suffering under that judgment of not being able to attain the full potential that they might have been able to attain, to build a tower that goes right up to heaven and challenge God and so forth. So they are limited by the judgment of God. But where's the positive side of that judgment? It's interesting that generally we wouldn't see it. And the reason we wouldn't see it is that as Westerners, most people today, I don't care if you're from Asia or Africa or where you're from, most people today have a considerable amount of Western thinking, which includes chronological thinking, that we're aware of the passage of time and we're aware that years and decades and centuries make a difference, you see. And so we would tend not to see the Abraham story as in any way related to the Tower of Babel, because by any accounting it was anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years after the time of the Tower of Babel. But in the Hebrew mind, that's not a big barrier, because the story in Genesis is intimately related. Genesis 12 is intimately related to what happened at the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. And I'd invite you to take a Bible and find Genesis 12 and read it together with me. In Genesis 11, you had a world that is in need of a blessing. It's a world under judgment. It's a world that's been scattered and so forth. And it needs some special blessing from God, and that's exactly what happens in chapter 12 and verses 1 to 3. And I'd like to read that with you together. Genesis 12 and verses 1 to 3. The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Now, if you will go to your reading once again, I want to show you on page 24, you will have some of this material, and there's an illustration at the bottom of page 24. You see the green box once again. So I'd like to have that in front of you at this point, because God offers a positive judgment through Abraham on all the nations of the world. Do you see that connection? All the nations of the world were in chapter 11. They were under the curse, under judgment. But now in chapter 12, God acts in behalf of the nations through the call of Abraham. Through Abraham, all of these nations would be blessed. So that is a very powerful aspect here. And you will notice there is a blessing. There is the concept of a nation, and there's a concept of the land. I want you to remember the three basic relationships in the Garden of Eden: a relationship to God, a relationship to the environment, and a relationship to each other. And we see those three relationships here again. God promises blessing, which will restore the relationship between God and the creation. God promises a land, which reminds us of the earth that is given to human beings to shepherd, to steward, if you will. And he also speaks of the nation, which implies a community, human beings in relationship to each other. So the three basic relationships of creation are at the core of this whole thing. And remember, the curse is simply the breaking of those three relationships. We saw how the relationship with God was broken, relationship between human beings and the earth was broken, relationship with each other was broken. So the original creation, three relationships, sin, damaging, breaking those relationships. And now we see in Abraham, God is addressing those same three issues there. Turn to Genesis 17. Genesis 17 and verses 1 and 8, or 1 through 8, because that essentially repeats the threefold promise. And it's important that we read both of these texts so that we see the full picture coming together. Genesis 17, verses 1 to 8. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. I will confirm my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers." What does that remind you of? Greatly increase your numbers. It's a reference back to the promise in chapter 1, a promise that was repeated in chapter 9, that human beings were to multiply and fill the earth. God says to Abraham, "I will multiply you. I will make you have many descendants." So here we see a reference back to the relationship. It is through sexuality, through human relationship between male and female, that this multitude of descendants, increasing the numbers, will occur. Verse 3, Abram fell face down, and God said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations." Well, now it's not just many descendants, but many nations will come from Abram. "No longer will you be called Abram, your name will be called Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." Hebrew language loves puns, by the way. And the at the end of Abraham means nation, and Av means father. So he's the father of many nations, Avraham. So your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I'll make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I'll establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you. You see what's happening here? God is restoring the relationship between himself and the human race through Abraham. Abraham will be the means of restoring what was lost in the Garden of Eden. So I will establish my covenant, etc. with you. Verse 8, the whole land of Canaan, where you are now an alien, I will give you as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be your God. So going back to page 24 of your reading, you will see in this box, it compares Genesis 12 and Genesis 17. You have the three relationships there, but they're described in terms of blessing nation and land in Genesis 12, but they're described in terms of a covenant relationship of many descendants and of Canaan, getting specific about that land. A particular portion of the earth would be the place from which Abraham's descendants would operate. So you have here that Genesis 12 and Genesis 17 are the same threefold promise repeated in different words. Now, if you will move ahead to page 25, I want you to notice the parallel between these three promises and also the three relationships back in creation. You have on page 25, you have the three relationships with God, with others, the earth, and you have the curse of Genesis 3. There's exile, which separates God from human beings. There is the childbirth pain, which challenges the relationship between Adam and Eve and their descendants. And then you have the thorns and the weeds and so forth, which reflect the breaking of the relationship between human beings and the earth. So we put this all together on page 26. If you go to page 26, near the top, you will see again a green box. And there it puts all of these together. The three relationships of creation are followed by the three breakings of relationship under the curse, Genesis 3. And Genesis 12 and 17 pick up on the same. In other words, the problem of sin is the breaking of relationship between human beings and God. In Genesis 12 and 17, that's restored through the blessing, which involves a relationship between God and Abraham, first of all, and then a relationship between God and the descendants of Abraham after that. The creation of male and female is distorted by sin, bickering and disagreement and fear coming into those relationships. And God promises Abraham that he will have many descendants. In other words, God will undo the curse in behalf of him and his family. And then finally, the dominion over the earth, which was ruined in Genesis 3, is to be restored through what God will do in the land of Canaan with Abraham's descendants. So we see really that Abraham's call is a call to restore the Garden of Eden. Abraham is invited to be the means of restoring the relationships that were broken in the context of the fall. So if you're following your outline from Module 7a, which is the Pentateuch, you'll notice we've covered three of those areas, or we've begun to cover them. Originally it's creation, then there's the primeval history, and now the third area is the patriarchal era, Abraham, and all that follows. And we have moved into that area at this point. Before we go to the rest of the book of Genesis, let me just call your attention on page 28 of your reading. Once again, there is a box there right smack in the middle, And as you look at that box, you will notice that these three promises, the promises of Genesis 12 and of Genesis 17, are really followed through in the rest of the Pentateuch, in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. If you want some kind of structuring guide as to what's going on in the 5 books of Moses, here it is. And that is that they are all grounded in the 3 promises to Abraham. The Genesis 12, 1-3, in a real sense, becomes the hinge of the entire Pentateuch. The promises to Abraham look back on creation and the fall, but the promises to Abraham also look forward to what God was doing for the nation. And in the book of Genesis, God focuses on the promise of many descendants and shows how he fulfilled that promise through some challenges. In Exodus and Leviticus, the focus is on the relationship between God and the people. God removes them from Egypt so that they can be dedicated to him as their true ruler. And then in Numbers and Deuteronomy, the focus moves to the land. So that's a summary, and I want to look a little bit at the details before we complete this particular lecture. So when you get to the book of Genesis, after the promises to Abraham, it seems to me that what we see is a life of frustration. Abraham's life must have been frustrating. Perhaps one of the reasons he's a hero of faith is that he needed a lot of it. God promised him some incredible things. I will make your name great. I will make you have many descendants. You will be the father of many nations. You will rule this land. Okay, these were promises made to Abraham. And what's the reality? The reality is that none of them were particularly fulfilled within the lifetime of Abraham. For example, as you go through the book of Genesis, the wives, the chief wives of all the patriarchs were barren. Abraham's wife Sarai, later Sarah, Isaac's wife Rebekah, and Jacob's wife Rachel, all of them were barren. And it was a great struggle for them to have children, and they were limited in numbers. There was sibling rivalry. Ishmael against Isaac, Jacob against Esau, Joseph against his brothers, and or more in reverse, I suppose. But you have threats to this many descendants that God promised. There are famines in chapter 12, 26, and 41. 3 famines are mentioned in simply the story of the patriarchs. So on all 3 of those occasions, they had to leave the land for a while. The famine was severe enough. So instead of abundance coming out of these 3 promises to Abraham, in Abraham's experience, and even in his son and grandson's experience, a lot of this is never quite fulfilled. As a result, we see the patriarchs doing expedients, like maybe Lot can be my son. Maybe Eliezer, my servant, can be my son. Maybe Hagar can have a son for Sarah. Lord, why don't you accept Esau? There's a number of ways in which you're recognizing that the patriarchs are pretty frustrated, and they're struggling to understand how these promises God made were going to be worked out. In fact, when Abraham dies, he basically has Isaac and Ishmael as sons that to some degree can fulfill the promise. He basically owns none of the land except a grave for himself and his wife. So his domination of the land never quite happens. And some of the blessings in his relationship with God certainly didn't seem all that clear. Was he a blessing to the nations? Seems like wherever Abraham went, plagues followed. When he went down to Egypt, Pharaoh's cattle stopped multiplying. His wives stopped having children. He recognized Abraham's visit as a curse. And there's several similar stories to that. Abraham tries to intercede for Sodom, and how far did that get? Sodom is destroyed. So the idea of being a blessing to the nations, the idea of dominating the land, the idea of having many descendants, none of that was fulfilled in Abraham's life. And in fact, when you get to the very end of the book of Genesis, you have about 70 people. That's the multitude. That's the many descendants like the sands of the sea. But at least it's a start. At many points along the narrative, it looked like it was all going to end, that there was just no descendants, there was just no security moving forward. But by the end of the story, you can see that the promise of many descendants, at least, is beginning to be fulfilled. Then, as you move ahead in Exodus and going on further, you find that the promises do get fulfilled eventually. And perhaps there's a bit of a lesson in that for us, because I think very often in our lives we have a sense that God is pointing us in certain directions, and it never quite seems to happen very often. All right, so number 4, let's move to the Exodus. And here we'll take a look at the rest of the Pentateuch. We spent extra time in Genesis because I think that's a crucial foundation, not only for the Pentateuch, but it's also a crucial foundation for the entire Bible in many ways. But another crucial foundation is the Exodus story. The Exodus event, in a real sense, is a focal point of the entire Old Testament. Once the Exodus has occurred, it's referred to over and over and over again, and we'll see examples of that. This is also true of the New Testament. The Exodus story is a foundation of how the New Testament writers describe the cross, the Lord's Supper. It is a Passover feast. The baptism is related to the Exodus, and so on. So you have much of the vocabulary of salvation in the New Testament is drawn from the Exodus story. So words like redeem, deliver, ransom, purchase, slavery, freedom, etc. In the Exodus event, God is fulfilling the promises to Abraham. The people move from a family to a nation. By the end of the Pentateuch, they are truly a nation in and of itself. The relationship with God is established as God removes the Pharaoh from the scene and brings them to himself. That relationship's established. And then, of course, the goal of the Exodus is the land of Canaan that God promised. 400 years after the promise to Abraham, finally, the people of God actually enter the land and have some reasonable expectation of thinking that the land belongs, in some sense, to them. So in the book of Exodus, the primary focus is the relationship promise. God promised to restore the relationship between the people and God that was lost in the fall. The first 18 chapters of Exodus describe how God removes Israel from its king, Pharaoh. God separates them from Pharaoh so he can bring him to his mountain, Mount Sinai, and there enter into a unique relationship to them. God is replacing Pharaoh as the king of Israel. In Exodus 19 through 24, then, the code there is ratified. God makes a covenant with the people. He grounds the relationship with them. And there they, in a sense, become married to him. It's a metaphor that's used later on quite frequently. Then comes the sanctuary in Exodus 25 through 40. And what's the purpose of the sanctuary? It's recognizing that while God has established his relationship with Israel in Exodus 19 to 24, that Israel, like most human beings, will tend to fall away, will tend to lose focus on that. And what do you do when the covenant is broken? What do you do when God has entered into relationship with a whole nation, that nation turns away from him? What can God do? And the solution is the sanctuary. And in the sanctuary, God offers provisions to maintain the covenant. When the covenant is broken, what do? Well, you bring these lambs, you go through these ceremonies, you take up these attitudes and so forth. In the sanctuary, the covenant can be re-established and put together in the way that it's supposed to be. So the book of Exodus describes the physical exodus of God's people, describes their entering relationship with God, and then receives the sanctuary as the way in which they can maintain that relationship with God. And of course, the book of Leviticus naturally follows the book of Exodus because it also focuses on those sacrifices. So the book of Leviticus continues to spell out how the relationship between God and his people could be maintained in spite of the fall, in spite of human sin. The sanctuary is a remedy for sin. What's the problem of the sanctuary? People are dirty. They need to be cleansed. People are guilty. They need acquittal. People owe God a debt. They need to bring a lamb, and then they can be forgiven. So you have the sanctuary as being like a giant metaphor of how to deal with the problem of human sin. So in the book of Leviticus, the relationship between God and the people is maintained through the sacrificial system. And one of the great themes of Leviticus is worship. And since we have mentioned worship in the previous module and how worship is associated with rehearsing the mighty acts of God, there are 4 ways that worship occurs in the book of Leviticus. One of these is through sacrifice. Another is through the feast days. Another is through the praise of God, singing psalms. And another is prayer. But the particular focus in the book of Leviticus is the sacrifices, and the feast days are the means by which God has chosen to maintain his relationship with the people. Book of Numbers continues the story of Leviticus. It continues describing sacrifices and so forth, at least through chapter 10. And then it returns to the narrative of how Israel was about to go into the promised land, how doubts come in, how they begin to question whether God has led them correctly. And you have then the tragic sentence that they're to spend a whole generation, 40 years, wandering in the wilderness. But toward the end of the book of Numbers, Israel comes to the end of the 40 years and begins invading on the east side of the Jordan, the Transjordan area, and that's where the story takes us. And Moses comes to the place where he's going to die, and so the book of Deuteronomy then is sort of like Moses' last will and testament. It's his final sermon before Israel goes into Israel proper, to the promised land. Moses prepares the way with the book of Deuteronomy, which is called second law in the Greek. If Leviticus is the first law, then Deuteronomy is the second law. The laws of Leviticus relate to the experience in the desert after the Exodus. The laws of Deuteronomy deal with what life will be like in relationship to God when they are settled in the promised land. So it's interesting how the laws of Leviticus and Deuteronomy are shaped to the context in which they are. It's a very different thing to be living in a tent, to be moving around all the time, to have a Bedouin existence. That requires one type of laws. On the other hand, Deuteronomy is about a settled condition, and the laws there are a little bit different as a result. To give you one example, in Leviticus, when they want to make a sacrifice, they simply bring it to Jerusalem, and bring it to the sanctuary, which is right in the middle of the camp. It's a matter of a few steps. And there, the requirement is that the priests and the Levites must sacrifice the animals. You see, and that's true even for food. If they are slaughtering animals for the sake of food, they are to bring it to the sanctuary. Let the priests do it. Let it be done properly by the experts who know how to do it. Well, when they get to the promised land, that's no longer realistic. I mean, if every time you wanted to have some meat, you got to take the animal 100 miles and have the priest do it and then bring it back, it would probably be green by the time you returned and not very palatable. So the rule there says go ahead and do your meat preparation where you live, but make sure you follow these rules. You see, so. Deuteronomy and Leviticus are laws that are designed for two different contexts, and that explains some of the interesting differences between them. In the book of Numbers, you start with the sanctuary, but then the story moves to the land. The focus increasingly becomes the land, and in the book of Deuteronomy, it's all about the land. So the land side of the promise to Abraham is the focus of the latter part of Numbers and also of the book of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is like a constitution of a new kingdom. It's how they are to respond to God's acts for them as a nation. It's a renewal of the Sinai covenant in light of a new situation. In the Deuteronomy, you have a lot of blessings and curses. You have God saying, if you do this, you'll be blessed. If you do that, you'll be under the curse. You'll have negative consequences. But Deuteronomy is focused on the nation as a whole. If the nation obeys God, it will prosper. If the nation disobeys God, it will suffer consequences. As we mentioned in Module 6, when you get to Psalms and Proverbs, you often have an individualizing of those promises. If an individual obeys, they will prosper. If they disobey, they will not. And as you know, in most circumstances of life, it isn't necessarily so. In other words, circumstances alter cases. Things are not always equal. But to the degree that things are equal, the principle of obedience does prosper one. But in Deuteronomy itself, the focus is definitely on the nation rather than on the individual. Now we come to the fifth and the last part of this particular lecture. It is module number 7. It is letter A still. The very last part is entitled The Pattern of God's Saving Action. We've walked very briefly through the Pentateuch from Genesis through Deuteronomy, spent most of our time in Genesis, setting the foundation, and then showed how in the rest of the Pentateuch you see the fulfillment of the 3 promises to Abraham. God promises him a relationship. This is established at Mount Sinai and in the sanctuary services. God promised Abraham to have many descendants, and certainly by the time of Exodus story, Israel is a quite numerous nation. Then you also have the promise of the land, and by Numbers and Deuteronomy, that promise is in the prospect of being fulfilled. So you see then that through the Pentateuch as a whole, the promises are fulfilled. Let me emphasize once more, though, the key concept. The text above all texts in the book of Genesis is chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. That original promise to Abraham looks back. It's a hinge text. It looks back to, first of all, the creation, the 3 relationships of creation, and it looks back to the fall, the breaking of those three relationships. These three promises to Abraham, though, also look forward in the Pentateuch. They look forward to the fulfillment of the many descendants that begins toward the end of the book of Genesis, where you have as many as 70 who can call themselves relatives of Abraham. Then in Exodus and Leviticus, you see God establishing the relationship between himself and Israel. He's fulfilling that promise of blessing and relationship to Abraham. And then finally in Numbers and Deuteronomy, you see the fulfillment of the promise that he would be settled in a land that God would show him. So Abraham, in a real sense, is called to restore the entire human race, to restore the Garden of Eden, that in establishing the blessing to Abraham, God will ultimately bless all nations and all peoples, as we see clearly stated in Genesis 12, 1-3. Now, there's a very interesting text that is sort of a philosophical basis, perhaps, for what we're about to do. And that's in Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, and begin with verse 11 and much of what follows up to verse 15. And chapter 3, verse 11, it says, "He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end." And verse 14, "I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that men will revere him. Whatever is has already been, and whatever will be has been before, and God will call the past to an account." Here the focus is definitely on the actions of God, and it indicates that there will be a pattern in God's actions. As you observe the past, the present, and the future, you will see a pattern developing in terms of the actions of God. What has been will happen again. What is now has already been before. What will be is grounded in what has currently taken place. So this statement suggests that we should be seeing patterns in God's saving activity as we work our way through the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. As we look at the Old Testament, we discover that there are four great, mighty acts of God. There's the creation, there's the flood, there's the Exodus, and then there's the exile to Babylon and the return. In a real sense, these four actions frame everything that takes place in the Old Testament. The Exodus in particular is the one act of God that is constantly referred to. It's modeled on the first two, creation and the flood, and it's the model for the exile to Babylon and the return, as we will see. So what we want to do right now is compare the first three of those mighty acts, and then the rest of the Old Testament will be the focus of upcoming lecture video. So here we see the pattern of God's saving action in creation, the flood, and also in the creation, the flood, and in the Exodus story. What I want you to do at this point is go back to your reading, and if you have a printout or if you have it electronically in front of you, you'll notice page 29. And if you look on page 29, there's a green box again, a little bit below the midway point on the page, and it's entitled "The Pattern of God's Saving Actions." And I want you to notice that you have creation, the flood, and the Exodus. They are put side by side here in this particular box. And you can see how the different words used for these are paralleled to each other. There's no question that the Exodus is modeled on the creation and the flood, and that there are patterns there. If you will go to that with me, take a look at your in your reading. You'll see the three side by side in that green box. And you'll notice right at the beginning that creation and flood both begin with chaos. In both instances, the waters completely cover the earth. The entire earth is underwater. That was the condition before creation. It's the condition in the middle of the flood story as well. But you will notice that under Exodus, it talks about spiritual chaos. In the one hand, the Red Sea is the chaos, but it's a much more limited. It's similar in experience to the flood story and the creation, but it's on a much smaller scale. In a real sense, the chaos of this story is slavery. It's the people of God being under the subjection of someone other than God. Someone else has dominion over his people when God should have been the one. So there is, you could say, a spiritualizing of the type. In the Exodus story and in the stories that follow, the pattern of creation is still followed. But often it is on a more spiritual level. In other words, rather than some literal thing, water is actually covering the earth, dry land appearing. The language is still there, but the spiritual reference becomes stronger. In the Exodus story, there's waters covering the ground. There's a dividing of the waters. There's dry land appearing. There's a passing through the waters as Israel walks through, etc. So there are patterns in the language that is used there. But now the purpose of the story is not just a physical rescue, but also a spiritual rescue. God is rescuing the people from Egypt to bring them to himself. God is removing them from their king, the Pharaoh, and he is bringing them to himself as their new king, as the head of a theocracy, if you want to call it that. So we see in this pattern that the Exodus clearly builds on creation and the flood. It doesn't pick up on every detail, but it definitely is using the earlier language for a purpose. And as we studied exegesis, I think you'll remember that exegesis focuses on the language of the biblical writer. What was the writer trying to say? And that language out of necessity is the language of the past. And because it's the language of the past, it is necessary that human beings understand that past in order to understand what God is saying here. In the Pentateuch, of course, the language is all part of the same narrative, and you can see how the language is related between those three. What do we learn from this recurring pattern? There are a number of things that are there to learn, and I want to show you an illustration that may. If you will go back to your learning materials section in the 7th module, you will see a link that's entitled Lessons from the Pattern. And if you'll click on that link right now, Lessons from the Pattern, you will see a PDF document that will look just like this. Simply one page, but it's an outline of what I'm going to share with you now, and I think it'll be helpful for you to follow that outline. There's lessons we can learn from the patterning between Genesis, the creation story, the flood story, the Exodus story. We've already noticed that God is consistent. His actions are consistent. You could say he's faithful to his promises. So the past actions set a pattern. Creation sets a pattern for the flood. Creation, the flood set a pattern for the Exodus. There's going to be a pattern there because God is consistent. But second, God carries out much, but not all, of the pattern. To put it in another way, God is unpredictable. God is not bound to carry out every detail of the pattern. Third, God is not limited to previous patterns. He can do new things at times that become patterns for later actions. This dynamic of three that we mentioned earlier is also critical when it comes to Bible prophecy. Because in Bible prophecy, we sometimes expect that God must fulfill every single detail of the prophecy, or it's not a fulfillment. And that is not what you see in fulfilled prophecy in the Bible. That God seems to leave things open. The language used can allow God to go in a number of different directions depending on how circumstances play out and depending on how human beings respond. A fourth thing that we learn from the patterns of creation, flood, and Exodus is that God sometimes spiritualizes the type. In other words, He can take a literal event like the waters covering the earth, and that can become a metaphor for God's people being burdened under sin, or the Israelites being burdened under slavery. So God can take a literal historical event, and that can become a type of a spiritual condition or a spiritual action that God will do at a later time. So we see in this pattern the spiritualization of the type. And this becomes very important when we get to the New Testament, because some people will accuse the New Testament of distorting the Old, of going in some new direction, completely ripping up the old faith. That's not the attitude of the New Testament. The New Testament rewriters believed they were giving the real meaning of the Old Testament. And they could say that because they were reading the Old Testament typologically. In other words, seeing the literal actions of Israel and of God as setting models for spiritual realities that were being experienced in New Testament times and beyond. This is a very important principle. Number 5, it seems that as you go through all of these books, that Israel is constantly faithless and God is constantly faithful. And that's probably the story of the whole Old Testament. God is faithful, but Israel often is not. In fact, rarely is Israel faithful. So you have a dynamic of a God in relationship with a people that isn't listening most of the time, isn't performing most of the time. And perhaps you and I should feel very related to that. And then number 6, the present in each of these cases was described in the language of the past. God describes the Exodus through the pen of Moses in language reminiscent of creation and the flood. God uses the language of the past to describe what He is doing in the present. And we see that particularly strongly in the Exodus story. As the writers of the Bible describe God's activity in their experience, they do so by means of language associated with God's activity in the past. So here we see in 7a a foundation for Scripture, a foundation for salvation. Salvation is rooted in the human condition. It is because of the human condition that salvation is needed. You can describe that condition in a variety of ways. All of them have value. And then salvation is describing how God deals with the human situation and brings about a positive outcome. So as we move forward in our study, we're setting the foundation for a biblical theology of salvation. And the outcome, I suspect, will be in many ways a surprise to most of you. So thank you for paying attention to this particular lecture video. This is the conclusion of Module 7, letter A, in which we have been looking at the Pentateuch as a whole, setting a foundation for the rest of Scripture.